Good morning. Hi, my name is Eric Jenkins, and I'm the chair of the Board of Directors for Berks Nature. Welcome to our 13th annual State of the Environment Breakfast. It's wonderful to see you all this morning, and it makes me especially happy to see you all here in person. Having more than 350 people come together, which, by the way, is a record attendance for this event, shows just how committed we all are to the environment in this region. It gives me hope to see what we can accomplish when we share a common goal. Thank you for joining us today. The primary goal of the State of the Environment program is to raise awareness for conservation choices we can make in Berks County that will improve our environment, locally, regionally, and globally. Last year, we had to hold a virtual breakfast, and we focused our attention and publication on healing in nature. Our website, berksnature.org, has a full copy of that report, as well as all of our former State of the Environment publications. We are fortunate to have committed members on our board of directors and talented staff members who help shape the work of Berks Nature every day. I've been involved with Berks Nature for years, and this is just a great collection of wonderful people. Could all the members of the board and the staff please stand so you can be recognized and thanked with a round of applause? Thank you all for your service and commitment. I'd also like to acknowledge the many sponsors who helped make today's event possible. In particular, I'd like to recognize and thank our top sponsor, UGI Utilities, for providing funding for this year's event. You can find a listing of all of our sponsors on the inside of your program. And finally, I want to give a special thank you to the more than 100 students who have joined us today from around the county, including students from Kutztown, Governor Mifflin, Conrad Weiser, Berks Catholic, Wilson, Brandywine Heights, Tulpehocken, Albright College, Alvernia University, and Reading Area Community College. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy our program this morning. Our speaker has a lot to share, and we're expecting to have it wrapped up and on your way by around 9:30. I'd now like to introduce our president, Kim Murphy. If you've been part of Berks Nature for a while, or if you've been to the Nature Place recently, you see she's making a lot of great things happen. Kim? Good.
Thanks, Eric. It is so wonderful to see all of you here and in person. We weren't really sure how people would react to an in-person event again. So as Eric mentioned, it's our largest breakfast, and we are so grateful that you're all here. Berks Nature believes that nature is essential to our quality of life, and we demonstrate that belief through conservation, protection, partnerships, leadership, and education. We are a non-governmental, charitable land trust and conservation organization, and we've been serving the Berks County community since 1974. Some of you may remember we operated for many years under the name Berks County Conservancy. Changed our name to Berks Nature about 8 years ago. We're supported through contributions made by individuals and corporations and foundations who are a direct reflection of the community that we serve. Before we get to our speaker, I'd like to share with you a little bit about our publication and what Berks Nature has accomplished this year, and perhaps more importantly, where we are headed. So earlier this year, our board member Rodney Ridley introduced us to a company that produces augmented reality content for organizations looking to make their publications come alive. VisVibe knew that so much of what we do is visual and experiential that they wanted to help us with kind of make the most of our materials. So our 2021 State of the Environment publication is our first publication with augmented reality content. And as best as we can tell, one of the only AR publications in the community. So how does this work? First, You need to get the Berks Nature app. So you're going to go to the App Store and search for Berks Nature. It's available on both Apple and iOS platforms. You'll download the app. And the app actually has a lot of information about Berks Nature, including our trail maps. And you'll find an AR scanner on the homepage of the app. And all you have to do is point that to wherever you see the leaf from our logo on the publications that says Scan Here. It's important not to be too close, as the reader needs to capture some of the surrounding context photos to recognize which AR content to share with you. But each scan area will take you to more photos, they'll take you to videos, and allow you to experience more in person some of the gardens and things that we are highlighting in our publication this year. We expect to produce more materials that enhance your interaction, not just through print, but additional media as well. So please take some time later today to enjoy all of the content that we have packed into our State of the Environment publication for you, and let us know what you think. There are also handouts on your table that will guide you through that process as well. I am so proud of the way our staff and board weathered this past 18 months. We really did some amazing things this year. We continued to protect land, we worked hard on restoring watersheds, worked with farmers to improve management practices on their farms to protect water, and we kept our nature preschool open and created a Camp for School program for families who needed help with virtual learning. Our trails and preserves remained open for members of our community to connect with nature during this unprecedented pandemic. Our volunteers continued to monitor water quality and plant thousands of trees, and our community gardens remained open for city residents to grow the fresh food that they needed. We did all of this following scientific guidance as best we could. Our board and staff also took some time to do some strategic planning and look toward our future. And our new strategic plan outlines our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, to climate change, to our community, and to a future generation of conservationists. In short, we seek to transform people's relationships with nature. We've outlined some bold strategies and vision, and I'd like to share them with you and update you on just some of the things that we've done this past year. Berks Nature will expand and grow our land protection, watershed restoration, and recreation activities. We want to encourage others to make a lasting impact on our environment through best land use practices, land and wildlife habitat protection, watershed restoration, and we want all open space and agricultural land identified in the Berks County 2030 Comprehensive Plan to be permanently protected by easements or outright purchase. And we want to see that trails connect to key hubs and preserves. By the end of 2021, we will permanently protect 3 additional properties covering over 163 acres of forest, farm, wetland, and open space. This includes a 68.5-acre easement on the Ormai Farm in Maxatawny Township. We added to our already existing 29-acre easement an additional 65 acres to the Bachelor Coil Farm in Union Township, and next month, 30 acres of wetlands and forested headwaters of the exceptional Pine Creek will be permanently protected on the Morning property in Pike Township. This adds to our overall total of over 9,400 acres of land protected or owned by Berks Nature. Working with our amazing watershed partners like the Schuylkill Action Network, the Berks County Conservation District, Western Berks Water Authority, the Berks County Department of Ag, the Army Corps of Engineers at Blue Marsh, and many more, we restore hundreds of acres of degraded land and habitats each year. The installation of ag best management practices follows a whole farm approach with multiple sources of private and public funding. One such restoration activity is tree planting. In 2021, Berks Nature planted over 715 trees, native trees, with fabulous volunteers. And I should say that our efforts are more than just planting trees. We want them to grow. So we plant large trees, 2 to 6 year old native trees with Berks Nature ambassadors and our local watershed associations. Of course, trees benefit our air, our water quality and quantity, and help us to satisfy our critical need for carbon storage. The planting of native trees and bushes is among the most important things we can do to mitigate climate change. Another of our strategies is that Berks Nature will expand its environmental and conservation education programs. We want to make sure that every child in our community has an experience with Berks Nature through our environmental education programs. We want to have multiple locations of our nature preschool to begin to grow the next generation of conservationists, and scholarships available so that there are fewer barriers for people to share in that experience. This past year, when students attended school remotely, we gave parents a safe place for them to learn and grow. Assisting with their online courses, our K through 6th grade Camp for School gave kids the much needed help to succeed online and got them outdoors as much as possible. And that allowed parents to return to the workforce. Our nature preschool has remained open. Now in its 4th year, we have over 40 families who are part of our fully state licensed nature preschool. We build on the children's inherent curiosity about the world by using hands-on, nature-based activities to foster social, emotional, physical, and academic skill development. And our kiddos are outside 75% of the day. This summer, over 275 children enjoyed our summer eco camp. We have limited numbers due to COVID, but we were sold out for all 10 weeks. Campers enjoyed joining us to learn about animal habitats, water conservation, aquatic life, gardening, archery, and much more. We've amped up our programming at locations throughout the county as well, including a partnership in Boyertown with the Colebrookdale Railroad, and tabling at numerous fairs and parks. We've continued our Nature RX program in partnership with Penn State Health Reach Project and the Berks County Medical Society, as we advocate that everyone spend at least 120 minutes outside in nature every week. People can join the fun and learn more at berksnaturerx.com, and while you're at it, download the Goose Chase app and join us for a virtual scavenger hunt and win prizes. A unique partnership was started this summer with the Science Research Institute at Albright College, one that we've named One World. Our seasonal teachers were in every junior high school in the Reading School District for at least 1 week this summer. Students learned about camouflage, metric measurement, they flew drones in their gymnasium, they created with 3D pens, and they built their own watershed models, just as an example of some of their activities. In order to make all of that happen, you need a good staff and volunteer base. Our third strategy is that we will invest in and grow our human resources to facilitate the organization's growth and meet our critical mission. We've been understaffed for many years now and look to build our staff to the level of where we're working and where we want to go. We've added a new preserve and trail position so that we have the talent on staff to care for what we own and manage. We've added an engagement and volunteer coordinator to help us involve people in our work. And we have 2 positions to fill by the end of the year, a Spanish-speaking educator and a lobby and store manager. We include our volunteers as part of our human resources, and we're proud to have graduated another class of trained Berks Nature ambassadors. Our ambassadors help us deliver programs, manage invasive species, and along with our watershed volunteers, help monitor water quality. We will welcome a new class of ambassadors this spring, so it's not too late to sign up for the fun. And thanks to the hard work of the Hay Creek Watershed Association and assistance from Senator Schwenk's office, we will dedicate the Hay Creek pedestrian bridge in 2 weeks. A strategy that's been part of our plan since I have been here includes that Berks Nature will increase and strengthen its funding. Excuse me. Our focus here is diversifying our funding so that we're able to address mission-related needs. We want to expand and grow the engagement of our community with nature, and will increase opportunities for individuals and groups to connect with nature, advocating for a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We've introduced a text-to-give program. If you text NATURE to 20222, you can make a $20 contribution. We've updated our former membership program so that anyone who makes a contribution of any size becomes a champion of nature. There are a variety of benefits, including early access to EcoCamp registration. We have had for several years now a diversity and inclusion statement for the organization, and so it was not difficult for us to add a specific strategy looking at inclusion. Berks Nature will continue to become more diverse and inclusive, with particular attention paid to urban BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. We look to be active in and include and nurture our urban communities to become involved in our organization, connect to and take responsibility for nature in their community, and pursue conservation as a career path. Berks Nature hosts 1 or 2 fellows for 12 weeks during the summer. The program aims to increase and engagement and action toward protecting and restoring the Delaware River watershed. The Fellows Program is intended to encourage people of color to enter the environmental education field, and we're proud to have hosted a fellow each summer since the program started, with the exception of 2020. We're working hard to engage more communities in the city. And finally, the State Department of Conservation and Natural Resources has created beautiful signs for all the state parks and education centers. They're offering them for use to organizations like ours, and we will be personalizing and adding these signs to our preserves that remind everyone that nature is for all. All are welcome here. And finally, our beautiful nature center, the Nature Place. Berks Nature will utilize the Nature Place to expand its educational programs, increase sustainability, and grow our community's involvement in preservation and appreciation of natural resources. We want the Nature Place to continue to be a hub of environmental activity, community engagement, and location for organizations to meet. Since our involvement in Angelica Park, the park has matured into a spectacular urban stormwater park with native trees and shrubs and an important wetland. Here's what the park looked like 10 years ago. And here's a picture of the Nature Place, and here's what the park looks like now. Here's a picture of the Nature Place, which opened in 2017. And since then, we've identified a need for a covered structure to accommodate large groups of children for field trips and large groups of individuals for programs. So we engaged the designers of the Nature Place, GWWO Architects out of Baltimore, Maryland, to design a second-floor rooftop deck and classroom that will in total accommodate about 300 people. And so this is what the building looks like now. Yesterday, in fact. Berkey Construction is managing this project, and we are proud to welcome back many of the contractors who built our Phase 1 building. Our new building will have a gathering space with a fireplace, a meeting room for about 150, and a rooftop deck that will also accommodate about 150. All this new space, in addition to our educational lobby and classrooms and meeting rooms, are available to rent or to provide programming on a whole host of topics. Our strategic plan is an aggressive one. We've outlined many hopes and dreams and plans, and to achieve such an ambitious vision, it will take resources. Human resources, financial resources, and capital resources. And we are so grateful for our many supporters and contributors for helping us to get to this point. Thank you all. As Eric mentioned earlier, last year's virtual State of the Environment program focused on how we all turned to nature for healing during this pandemic. We shared stories of individuals and their love of the outdoors. And this year, instead of highlighting how nature heals us, we thought we would focus on how we can heal nature. And thus our topic today, growing natives for climate and wildlife. I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Tallamy speak last year and was immediately impressed with the depth of his research and how he talked about the necessity and value of native plants to all of our wildlife, primarily birds. After hearing his lecture, I would tell anyone who would listen, a bird needs a certain bug, and the bug needs a certain plant, and I would tell them all about the importance of the insects and caterpillars and how they sustain wildlife and the essential role that plants play in that food source. We are so pleased to have him live and in person with us this morning. Douglas Tallamy is an American entomologist, ecologist, and conservationist. He is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He has written and co-authored several books as well as many papers. Dr. Tallamy advocates for home gardens that bridge the gaps between parks and preserves in providing habitat for native species. He's spoken on the connections between plants and insects and how those relationships are important to birds. He's called for smaller lawns and has overseen rigorous field studies that examine native versus introduced flora. Doug Tallamy has spent his career working to understand the role of insects and plants in creating biodiversity. And in his latest book, Nature's Best Hope, that you'll all get to take home this morning, he advocates for creating ecological corridors through the actions of individual landowners. The highest impact actions we can take are to reduce the size of our lawns and increase the footprint of native plants. Please join me in welcoming Doug Tallamy this morning.
Well, thanks very much, Kim. Any questions? This is an exciting day for me because I get to talk to young people. You old people, I'm kidding. Let me get my things to work here. I do want to talk about my idea of what Nature's Best Hope is, but before I do that, I want to talk about E.O. Wilson's idea about how we're going to save life on planet Earth. Edward O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus at this point, he's 92, but he still writes a book every year. He's really, without question, the most impactful biologist alive today. And in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life on Earth. And his message was very clear. In order to save life anywhere on Earth, we're going to have to dedicate half of the Earth for nature. And then he spends most of the book talking about the research that supports that statement. If we're in conservation, that sounds like a great idea. We're going to save half the Earth, but we're still scratching our heads. How can we do that? Half of planet Earth is already in some form of agriculture, at least the terrestrial forms. And then we've got almost 8 billion people in the other half with all of our detritus and our roads and our airports, our hardscape. There is not a third half that we can put aside for nature. So how can we do this? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. I do believe that we can realize E.O.'s dream, but we're going to need a new approach to conservation. We're going to have to become one with nature in order to achieve this. So before we talk about that, let's talk about what happened in 2019. We had what we call an oak mast. Members of the Red Oak Group all got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. I'm easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of that acorn. First it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through that hole, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally it plopped down, and that's a dangerous time for this insect because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. People think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are all the way at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts and they chew a hole into the egg of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets down into the acorn. Well, you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year like most insects? And the answer is it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. And if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Once they have left the acorn, of course, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes created by acorn weevils after they've left acorns. And if scouts find a new acorn with a new hole, they get very excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs. There's a big parade into the new acorn. It takes about 30 minutes for the new colony to complete that move. Then they post a guard at the edge there. You might see a little antennae. Make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they're going to live for the next 2 years. What's my point? That is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, mostly between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns, and oaks depend on that. The relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they feed their young, carpenter ants. They rear their young carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them are highly specialized on the pollen of particular plant genera. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. So I could talk the rest of the year about nature's specialized relationships. Point I want to make, though, is that today these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon and stood on the edge and looked out and said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other such remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. You might wonder why we've done that. I wonder why we've done that. And I don't know, but I suspect that we thought the Earth, our nest, was so large that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing pretty regular headlines, scary headlines, such as this one: the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one: North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's almost a third of our North American bird population, already gone. And now the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report it as if it's just another headline. They might as well say, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years, and then go on as if it doesn't matter. It does matter. You know, we removed 23 species from the endangered species list 2 weeks ago, and we removed them because they're already extinct. This is not an option, folks. We cannot lose 1 million species. They're the things that keep us alive on the planet. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and thus upon all of our houses. That's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from a lot of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline: insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, again, E.O. Wilson told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects. And he did it way back in 1987 in this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, even many of our freshwater fishes, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, and that is that doesn't have to happen. We can keep that from happening. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature ourselves, we can save ourselves, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. And we're going to have to change the way we landscape soon. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on natural systems. We're dependent on the life support systems that ecosystems deliver us. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants and animals do. We say they do them for us. They do them for everything that's on the planet. So plants, they produce oxygen, pretty important. They clean our water and slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. They build topsoil, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, they convert sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that will be harder than eating this breakfast this morning. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of those flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this, and if this is anybody's house, I apologize, but designing landscapes like this is just not a good idea. They destroy the production of ecosystem services. It never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea. We need the production of more ecosystem services today than ever before because there's so many of us on the planet, 7.9 billion of us. Taking large portions of the earth out of production for reasons of aesthetics, it's just not a good idea. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups who have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, and going to another area doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. Aldo had a dream. He actually had a lot of faith in humans. He believed that we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough so that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this morning is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to rebuild nature where there are a lot of people, because that's almost everywhere. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where are we going to do that? Well, let's go back to private property. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and that's because most of the land is privately owned. East of the Mississippi, 85.6% of the land is privately owned. Texas, 98% of the land is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. We can't ignore all of that landmass because otherwise we'd be working in areas that are too small, too few, and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we need. Now, when I'm talking about rebuilding nature, you have to start with the species that contribute the most. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function, to natural systems equally. So we have to start with the building blocks, and we can add the other species later. And there are two groups of species that we can't ignore. The first is the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow those flowering plants to reproduce. They, of course, are capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food and storing that food in their tissues. So now we have energy from the plants stored in tissues. We now need to get those tissues, or the energy from plants to animals. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat invertebrates that ate plants, and those invertebrates, it turns out, are insects most of the time. And in order to sustain the food webs, to get the food from plants to vertebrates, we're going to need caterpillars, because caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we failed. We will have failed food webs. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. You're right here on the border where the Carolina chickadee drops out and the black-capped chickadee comes in. There's actually a hybrid zone right here. But they're practically the same bird doing the same thing. Chickadees, of course, are at our feeders right now, eating seeds, so people think that's what chickadees need. 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seed. The other 50% is insects and spiders. And when they are reproducing, their babies cannot eat seeds. So they switch entirely to insects, and most of those insects, when they're in a healthy environment, will be caterpillars. And it turns out that chickadees are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. Go back here. How do I know that? There's a lot of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students, Ashley Kennedy, did a few years ago. Some of you may have contributed. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're carrying food to the nest. And they're supposed to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items that are in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet of as many species of birds in North America as she could. And you're looking at a summary of her results. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, if we design landscapes without enough caterpillars, most of our birds are not going to be able to successfully reproduce. Which means there's something special about caterpillars. There's a lot of other insects out there. What is special about caterpillars? There's actually several things that are special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they are soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage, like what you just ate, with a very thin wrapper. A thin wrapper is his exoskeleton. It's his cuticle. It's made of chitin, and it's undigestible, and birds don't want a lot of that. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear its young, they're pretty rough. It's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass, the weight of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They are nutritious. They're high in fat, high in protein. They have a low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And many beetles have very sharp edges, too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. And you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. So where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From what they eat, of course. But carotenoid content in bird prey items is not equal. Those tall bars, I don't know if it's your right or left, the ones that are high, those are caterpillars. They've got a lot more carotenoids than other types of insect prey. If you see the little butterfly down there, that's the adult caterpillar, the adult moth. And they have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And finally, the bar at the other side is earthworms. So the early bird gets a worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? 1 or 2 a day enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees. We've got a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? 1 or 2 is not enough. 1 or 2 a day is not enough. It takes thousands of caterpillars to get 1 clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days. So you were talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make 1 clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want caterpillars to breed in your yard, and I would think not caterpillars, if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places that's all we have, then you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard. Chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot, and that is typical for most birds. And if we landscape in a way that does not create all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's looking like it's one of the main causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial birds into 2 groups. The birds that require insects at some part of their life history, and the birds that do not require insects at some part of their life history, typically when they're breeding. So things like the doves and the finches can actually reproduce on seeds. They make a little milk out of it, and that's what they feed their baby. Well, the big bar there on my left that represents the birds that require insects. They lost, on average, 10 million individuals per species. But the birds that do not require insects didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. This does not prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take away bird food, you take away the birds. So we need a new goal to how we're landscaping, why we're landscaping. Yes, we want to landscape for beautiful landscapes, and I know we'll keep doing that. But we also need to landscape with ecological function in mind, and that means we've got to make landscapes that support insects, particularly a lot of caterpillars. How do we do that? Well, we do that by adding the plants that support caterpillars. That seems pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we choose. And we have to be fussy about which plants we choose because the insects, the caterpillars themselves, are fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates it perfectly. If you want monarchs in your yard, if you want monarchs to breed in your yard, you've got to have milkweeds. That is the only plant that they can eat. And that's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why is that? Well, it's because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty-tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect species can't adapt to all of them. So it picks 1 or 2 plant lineages that are really similar in how they're protecting themselves, and it develops specialized adaptations that circumvent those particular defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, specialized life history adaptations or behavioral adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But those adaptations don't happen overnight. It takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked in to eating those particular plants. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas or crepe myrtles or burning bush or any of the other things we like to landscape with, you won't create a single monarch butterfly. And the monarch is not going to start eating your hostas. It is locked into milkweeds, and its only option is to disappear. And this is why when we bring in plants from other countries, our insects, by and large, are unable to eat them. They have not had the opportunity to specialize them and develop the adaptations necessary to eat those plants. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild the food webs that supports the life around us, which we need to support ourselves, we need to choose the plants that are going to do that. Otherwise, it won't work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants. I'm going to start with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. That's what it looked like when we moved in. We got a piece of a farm that had been broken up. It was a very old farm, been farmed about 300 years. The soil was exhausted. And the last thing they did on that farm before they broke it up was to mow it for hay. So there are very few plants there. Well, our goal, of course, was to rebuild the food web on that piece of old farm. In order to do that, we've got to create habitats that allow a lot of caterpillars to exist. And I'm going to give you some examples of how I did that. So I wanted to attract a Canadian owlet to my yard. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what one looks like. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, in order to have Canadian owlets, you have to have meadow rue. That's the only plant they eat. More host plant specialization. And we didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure there was meadow rue around there about 300 years ago, but long gone. I don't know of any place around us with meadow rue. So I got some seeds and I planted meadow rue, and it grew really nicely. But this was early on, and I had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. Maybe they had to come all the way from Canada. I don't know. So I didn't even go out and check my meadow rue for, it must have been 2 months. And I walked by for another reason, and it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still surprised about that. And now we've got a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That is a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on that plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where there was some ditch daisy in a power line cut in Bear, Delaware, about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them, and they grew very nicely. I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Biden's, but it did, and now I've got a good population of both of those. So I've added 4 species to the property now. Wanted the Hackberry emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly around, but because it belongs here. It should be at our house, but as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted Hackberry celtis. I had to wait 4 years for the butterfly to find my hackberry, but it finally did. I checked one of my hackberry branches, walked by it in June, and there were 9 Hackberry emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So now we've added 6 species to the property. And that's how it went. I didn't plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that require goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now, this is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't found my goldenrod yet, but that's what its caterpillars look like. But this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. This is like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year, I go out in September, and I look for the goldenrod flower moth. One of these years, I'm going to find it, and that will be a great year. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear a lot of people, it's a great native plant, but I hear a lot of people don't like it. I don't know why they don't like it. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's got very nice, very nutritious berries for the birds in the fall, high in fat. It's an excellent pollinator plant, believe it or not. Has small, little, inconspicuous flowers, but the pollinators love it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the bees, not for you. So if it's not big and showy, that's okay. It's a great ground cover, but I planted it because it's the best host plant for supporting the large sphinx moths that are the primary component of cardinal diets. So things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent at our property, just because it's such a cool-looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. It's a specialist on elm, and of course, the Dutch elm disease took out our elms, so we didn't have any elms. But there are two big elms at the University of Delaware that did not die, and they make a lot of seed each year. So 19 years ago, right after we moved in, I gathered up some of the seeds, planted them at home. Those trees are now 80 feet tall, and they did bring in the double-toothed prominent right away. American elm. One of the evening primrose moth, because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth came. The adult spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages that I put on our property. But I want to talk about oaks for a while because they're so important. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. And people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say all the time, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if it has to be 400 years old before you enjoy it, you're right. You won't. But if you can enjoy what it's contributing to your yard ecologically, you can enjoy your oaks the very first year. And I can say that with authority because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild the moth, the caterpillar-based food web that's supporting the rest of life at my property by bringing in things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneited, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves there. So it's contributing part of its energy. You don't have to wait centuries for your oaks to start to rebuild the life at your property. And that's what our property looks like today, taken from the same place I took that first picture. Actually, today the leaves are falling, but I show you this so you can see that little patch of lawn there. We're very traditional. We've got lawn. But I put a lot of plants back, and immediately I started to see all these moths and the caterpillars coming back and the food web reassembling itself. So 4 years ago, I decided to make it a goal to try to take a picture of every species of moth on our property. I haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. I will get there. And I'm still at it, but I am up to 1,140 species of moths that I have photographed on our property. And we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have 44% of all the moth species that occur in the entire state. And we have them because we put the plants back. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we've recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our property. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we saw last year. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back, which means we can all do this. These are scary headlines, and if we just throw up our hands, we're going to go down the tubes here. We can fight back. Put the plants back, rebuild the life on your properties, and if everybody does it, we're going to win. But I know what you're saying. We've got 10 acres. A lot of people don't have 10 acres. Will it work on smaller properties? Well, let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres. That's 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they're in the middle of suburbia. They're surrounded by everybody with the big lawns. The first thing I did was get rid of the invasive plants that were on their property when they moved in. It was bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. They got rid of that. They put in 75 species of native plants, including a water feature that they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that were using their yard. And they're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. If anybody's a birder in here, you know that's a good number. And just to compare, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago, and I mean in Chicago. Right on the other side of that wall that you see in the back there is O'Hare Airport. There's one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. And on the other side of the house is Kennedy Expressway. And she has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all. It's a pretty 1/10 of an acre, but it's a little habitat island. She did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, and put in 60 species of native plants, a water feature for the birds, and then she sat back and started to count the birds using her yard, and she's up to 120 species, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago, and you can see one. All right, there's 4 things that we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we need to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to shrink the area that's in lawn in this country. We've got 40 million acres of lawn. That's a 2005 statistic, so you know it's more than that, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Now, I know we need lawn to advertise our high status and to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? If we replanted half the area that's in lawn, that would give us 20 million acres that we could use to create another national park. If we do it at home, we call it Homegrown National Park. That's what I've been calling it. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we will have the biggest national park in the country. What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with Mother Nature. And you can do it on your own terms. All you have to do is go outside. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people there with you last year. It's a parking lot. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential to develop that personal relationship. Not mediated by somebody else, not mediated by David Attenborough. He's great, but you got to do it by yourself. And I think this is extremely important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour to a natural area, and they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. And then they get back on the bus and they go home, and that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature at home, all they have to do is go outside and interact with it alone. No parental supervision. They will come home, I guarantee it. And this is so important because they are the future stewards of our planet. And if they don't understand why they need to be stewarding the planet, how to steward, if they don't love stewarding the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter. This is Zoe in Hawaii. On a very modest patch of nature. It's a little piece of lawn with a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to teach me how to hunt anole lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with sticks and leaves so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you crawl toward the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of that lizard. You develop a personal relationship with that part of nature. And I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground the rest of her life catching lizards in her best dress. But I guarantee she's going to remember doing that in Hawaii, and I guarantee she will be a good steward of the planet because of that. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do that now. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. It's free. And what you do is you enter where you live, your location, and the amount of area that you're going to convert to natives, that you have converted to natives, that you're protecting in some way. And your little piece of your county will light up. And you'll get to see everybody else in your county who's lighting up. And we're trying to pay a tech company so that the whole country will light up, and you can see biological carters form. You can see, we want this to become viral through social media so that we get that 20 million acres of lawn removed. And we're trying to reach the people that are not in the choir. So none of you, we were trying to reach everybody who didn't come today. And we're hoping that this will do it. And no, we're not using your data. I don't even know what that means. And again, it's free. Okay, so we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put back in the area we take out of the lawn? Some of them, I'm going to argue, have to be what I call keystone plants. Now remember what a keystone is. This is the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out, the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because keystone plants are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building outdoors as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They are essential. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do with our ornamental plants for the last 100 years. You're not through building your house when you have your keystone plants, but they're an essential part of it. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of native plants that aren't contributing that much either. So the real question is, which native species are going to support the pollinators and the caterpillars the best? And we should focus on them, at least in the beginning. The very best keystone plant in 84% of the counties in which it occurs is one of our oaks. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 species of caterpillars nationwide. Just as for comparison, tulip trees, wonderful trees, but they only support 21. Your local ginkgo supports 0. Your local crepe myrtle supports 0. So there's a huge difference among our plants, and if we choose the best ones, we can really put the life back. How do you find out what the keystone plants are where you live? You go to, this is an updated version of the National Wildlife Federation's website, Keystone Plants by Ecoregion. And it will, you pick out which ecoregion you live in. Right now it's at ecoregion level 1. We're going to move that to level 2, make it more specific. But it'll give you the top genera of both woody and herbaceous plants in your county, both for making caterpillars and for supporting specialist bees. Okay, so we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out now, particularly from Europe, which is demonstrating that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect decline around the world. And these are all the ways that our lights are killing our insects. Believe it or not, to me, this is good news. We have to reverse insect decline. They're the little things that keep us alive, remember. We've already lost 45% of the insects on planet Earth. If we can turn that around by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. That's pretty easy. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn the light off over my garage or my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize is that bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb that is out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our white wavelengths. If we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs, overnight we could save millions of insects and probably millions of dollars too, because of course LEDs are much more energy efficient. The fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. Now we're just starting to think about this, but I think it's a really important point. So I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. This is just an example. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from the tree, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 480 of those species, 94%, finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, but then they drop down from the tree and they wiggle their way underneath the ground to pupate under the soil, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree, and we mow and compact our soils so that they're rock hard and the caterpillars can't get underground. So this becomes, the way we landscape in so many places becomes an ecological trap. The moths come in, lay their eggs, the caterpillars grow, they drop down and die. And I am convinced this is another major cause of insect decline. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option for those caterpillars. This is what most people do. They have a tree in a yard. Now, we're just starting to measure how caterpillars actually do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood and then a native azalea and ferns and ground cover. It's a safe site. The caterpillar drops down, the soil's not compacted, they can easily get underground or spin a cocoon in the leaf litter there. Nobody's going to step on them, nobody's going to mow them. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put beds around your trees. Immediately your lawn is reduced, and all of those beds become safe sites. This is where you can use your native ground covers, things like wild ginger or foam flower or mayapple or ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. Those are red maple trees. Any caterpillar developing on those red maple trees can drop down into that fern bed, complete its development, even though this is the middle of a city. So we can do a lot better with how we landscape under our trees. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and the results of her study suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices, and that's good news to me. She asked a simple question: how well do suburban yards that are landscaped primarily with natives, none of them were 100% native, sustain chickadee populations compared to landscapes that have a typical abundance of introduced plants, which is, like 80-some% introduced plants. First thing she found is that when the landscapes are dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So you reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. There's a nest box in every landscape. And the chickadees came and they'd look around and they say, well, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce here. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. And you might say, well, that doesn't sound like huge differences. But if you put all that together in a population growth model, as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your landscape, this is what you get. We looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage. The dotted line in the middle of that graph is replacement rate. If you reproduce at that rate, if you make that many babies, you're replacing the adults that die every year, and it's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, anything above the dotted line there, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies than adults die, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. And those lines overlap where it's about 30% non-native woody plant biomass. Which means you can have up to 30% of the woody plant biomass in your yard non-native without destroying your local food web. You can still have breeding chickadees and presumably breeding other things as well. Which means 70% of your landscape needs to be powerful native plants. So this is the area of compromise that I'm talking about. It means you can have your ginkgo, you can have your forsythia, you can have your boxwoods. You can't have any invasive plants. Invasive plants are ecological tumors. They just keep growing and destroy the world. But there's many non-natives that are not invasive. You can have them as long as it doesn't exceed 30% of the plant biomass in your yard. And that's good news to me, because if my message was you can't use any non-native plants, very few people would listen. We love our non-native plants. But remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. So if we put the powerful native plants back, we can tolerate many of our non-natives. Can we use native plants in formal landscapes? Yes, we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. She sent it to me last spring. That's taken from a drone 400 feet up. It's a big garden, and every plant in that garden is a native plant, and you don't get more formal than that. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess it's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Yeah, put a fence around it. It formalizes it. It convinces people that it's not just a patch of weeds that you forgot to mow. It's beautiful. It's not very big. It's not meeting the needs of that many bees. But if everybody did it, it would help a lot. And remember why we need pollinators. You hear all the time it's because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. And then people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. I don't like that agricultural argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. How about this design? A Drew Latham design. It's much bigger. Imagine the amount of life associated with that little garden there compared to the amount of life on the grass next to it. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program. They call it the Lawn to Legume program, where the state is helping homeowners reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's a very popular program. Pennsylvania has a new lawn conversion program. I just learned about this. It's 2 years old. You can get up to $5,000 per acre of lawn that you convert to native plantings. Very popular. Florida. There's an island off Florida where they're paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. Rather than fining you because you've got endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it. Everybody would want one. St. Louis, Missouri, and Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on calorie pears. You take out a calorie pear, Bradford pear, and you get a free tree replacement. And even water utilities are getting into the act. And San Antonio, they're giving you $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants. And the big lawn conversion programs in the far west, particularly California, $2 per square foot rebate for the lawn you take out and replace with xeric plantings. California does not have one drop of water that it can allocate towards lawns. Okay, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and this is a big one. We've come to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it, but it's not essential. So if when push comes to shove, if resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. Resources are always in short supply, so nature's always taken a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We need to save nature, we need to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy them. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for starting the national park system. We need to save these wonderful places so that future generations can enjoy them. And I get that, but it suggests nature's there just for entertainment. It is far more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about that, but if we restrict conservation just to areas where there's not enough humans, we're going to fail, because those areas are too small, too few, too isolated. David Quammen has our great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That's a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which is acting like a Persian rug, and that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to grow our rug back together again, folks. We need to put the plants back, particularly those keystone plants, not just to build biological corridors so that plants and animals can move back and forth between viable habitat, but to create viable habitat where we've totally destroyed it. When we do this, it'll be the first time in modern history that we're actually coexisting with the natural world. Our third misstep is to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we did not see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because everybody on the planet depends entirely on quality ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, "The Western settler mindset is, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You are not born with those mindsets, you are taught them." We're very good at teaching what our rights are, but we are terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations towards planet Earth. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live, and if you do, it empowers you. We've got huge problems on the Earth, and so many people want to help, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can turn out their lights, one person can use keystone plants, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can remove the invasive plants on their property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can totally revitalize their little local ecosystem and contribute to the greater ecosystem around them instead of degrade it. And that shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about your little piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park, help a preserve. They're all underfunded, they're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power and the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. Now, I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
This little bag is for you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was so inspirational, really, really.
Thanks.
I'm going to go a little off script here and suggest that we have an opportunity, as many municipalities, local governments, county governments, state governments, have a choice about how they're going to spend their American Rescue Plan dollars. Imagine if 50% of those funds were put towards native gardening, native plantings. It would help a lot of our flooding issues that we're seeing, and many other issues that we're seeing related to climate change. So just a seed that I want to plant in your heads as you advocate in your local communities for how those dollars may be spent. So there you have it, the benefit of and value of native plants and the impact that you can make in your own small spaces and in your own yard. Thank you, Doug, so much for sharing your life's work with us. It truly is inspirational. We look forward to a continued year of growth at Berks Nature and an increased number of visitors to the Nature Place. We hope you'll join us in February as we reopen to the public and showcase our latest building addition, expanding our nature preschool enrollment, engaging more students and adults in our programs, protecting all those special landscapes that define Berks County, and helping farmers be more sustainable, restoring our watersheds, and creating new places to recreate are all on the agenda for us next year. Nature is essential to our quality of life. We invite you to become engaged in our conservation work. The health of our community depends on it. Please consider joining us as a champion of nature and help support our efforts. Be sure that you take one copy of Doug Tallamy's signed book. There may be additional copies on the tables, but those are for folks who were unable to join us this morning. So we would appreciate it if you would leave the extras behind. A reminder to get your parking validated before you go back to the garage. That can be done at the front desk. And finally, Globey will be outside the doors and available for photos in the lobby as you leave this morning. So thank you again for coming. Be safe and stay healthy and have a great day.